You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This is an episode about financial independence, and I'd like to share with you some really useful ideas for thinking about money. But before I do, I want to let you know about the new Voluntary Life community on Facebook. I've created a Facebook group for the Voluntary Life so that you can connect with other listeners and talk about things that you're interested in. I just set this up a few days ago and emailed my list about it, and there's already some really great discussions going on there. It's so cool. We've got people from all over the world. I'm just looking at one of the discussion threads about wherever everyone's from, and there are people contributing comments from the US, Portugal, Mexico, Germany, Ireland, Buenos Aires, England, Florida, Saigon, Vietnam, Uruguay. It goes on and on. There's more. It's really cool to see people from everywhere. And there are other nice discussions going on. I was just asking people about what kind of job-free lifestyle they're most interested in. And there's a lot of discussion about having a lifestyle business and unjobbing. Other people talking about extreme saving. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to provide a forum for listeners to connect with each other. And you're very welcome to join the Voluntary Life community on Facebook. It's free. Come along and introduce yourself. You can find the link in the show notes and on the Voluntary Life webpage. And on Facebook, you can just search for the Voluntary Life community. So if you go to the Facebook group and just ask to join, I will add you. And I look forward to seeing you in the Voluntary Life community group. So back to this week's episode. I want to share with you some big picture ideas about money. I've done a lot of episodes on financial independence, on managing your money, on investing, and all these kinds of things. And one of the reasons that I do these episodes is to get clearer in my own mind about what's really important for me about money. What are the most important things that I've learned from other people and the most useful tools that I know for managing money, for getting the best experience of financial life, and for achieving financial independence. I do talk about some very specific things to do with investment and finances and tools for managing money, but I've been trying to think through the higher level ideas that are most useful to me in terms of thinking about how to approach money. And thinking about this, there are three ideas that I want to share with you that are really, that I find really helpful in terms of clarifying for myself, what am I trying to do when it comes to money? And these are not my ideas. These are ideas that have come from other people. These are things that I've tried to clarify in my own mind. But as I've thought through it, I've realized there's a lot of other people who've got exactly the same approach. And that's reassuring, because when you find that a bunch of people converge on the same ideas, then I find that reassuring, because it means I'm not just making stuff up for myself. So here are the most useful ideas that I've found about how to think about your money. The first one is to treat your personal finances as if you were running a business. This is how I got into understanding my personal finances better, was through running a business first and through learning about the importance of financial controlling in my business and then applying the same rigor that I used to apply to my business to my own personal finances. And that's the attitude that underlies a lot of the previous episodes that I've done about how I think about money. For example, I do a monthly financial review and I track my spending and I do have a budget and I track my net worth and all of these things. And basically, I want the same level of transparency and analysis and forward planning and professionalism, basically, about money that I would apply to running a business. There's a finance blogger called Luke Landers who wrote an article about this back in 2006 called How to Be the CFO of Your Own Life. And he described how using a finance app that produced reports made him start thinking about his money in a much more professional way. And he wanted to actually manage his money more consciously because he felt like by acting more professionally about his own finances, he was able to have more control. And that's exactly how I look at it. And this is an idea that's very popular now. And J.D. Roth has just written a book called Be Your Own CFO. And he's got articles too about this approach, which is exactly the same approach that he takes. So I'll put the links to those articles in the show notes. But I just find that a useful concept to pull together a lot of the different things that I find helpful about personal finance. You know, when considering questions like, do I need a budget? Should I track my finances? do I need to look at all my assets and liabilities and work out my net worth? I mean, these questions, if you ask them in the context of, well, what would you do if you were a CFO and you were responsible for the finances of a company? If you apply that approach, it gives you a framework to think about managing your own money that I find really helpful. That's the way that I do it. And the key habit that sort of embodies this approach is doing a monthly financial review, which I did an episode recently about that. I'll put a link to that in the show notes too. But at the higher level, I just wanted to express that idea to you that I think if you think about your own money as if you were managing the finances of a business, it really helps you. Because what you're doing is giving yourself the benefit of taking responsibility for something in a way that you would do for other people if you were managing their money as a business. Why shouldn't you benefit from the same level of diligence and care that you would give to a company if you were managing the money of a company? So there you go. That's the first idea. The second idea I wanted to share with you is a high-level idea about the right attitude to have towards money if you want financial independence. And the way that I think about this now is summarized in the idea of being investment-oriented, not consumption-oriented. If you want financial independence, one of the key things that you need to do is reorient your spending away from consumption and towards long-term investment. And the reason I find this a helpful idea for myself is that it's not that consumption is bad per se. It's a question of opportunity cost. What you consume now, you cannot invest in the future. And investment is what's going to give you the freedom that comes with financial independence. So the more you consume, the less you invest. And this is a sort of idea that I use as a framework for thinking about things like minimalism and frugality and saving. Because ultimately what we're talking about is saving money and investing it wisely. I think it's very easy for discussions about minimalism and simplicity and frugality to treat consumption as if consumption itself is a bad thing, almost like a sinful thing or something that's wrong. But I think the key point is not that consumption is bad, it's that it wastes your potential for investment, and investment is what gives you longer-term freedom. And if you read a book like The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley, which is a great book and really, really helpful, this attitude of investment orientation rather than consumption orientation, it really describes well the attitude of first-generation millionaires in the US that Thomas Stanley surveyed in that book. People who become financially independent don't avoid consuming things because they somehow think consumption is bad. They limit their consumption because they have better things to spend the money on. And those better things are investment. And I find that a helpful framework when considering decisions about spending. The question is, do I really need to buy these things I want to buy for consumption, or can I better use the money to invest to provide freedom in the future? And when you have some rules in place about how much money you need to save and what level of a portfolio you can safely consume, then you can happily buy stuff with the amount of money that works for your financial independence. And I've done some podcasts about the so-called 4% rule and about ways to live from investments. So I'll put some links to those in the show notes too. But this is just a general framework to think about the trade-off between consumption and investment, and how financial independence is just really about reorienting yourself away from consumption, which is the norm, and more towards investment. The last big idea that I want to share with you, just as a kind of organizing idea, is the idea of passive investing. And this is something that I really appreciate. I've done lots of book reviews and podcasts in the past about the concepts behind passive investing. But the simplest way that I can express it is this. People who actively attempt to profit from short-term price fluctuations tend to lose money compared to people who just have a strategy for investment for the longer term and stick to it. The book that has all the evidence about that is called A Random Walk Down Wall Street by Burton Malkiel, and I did a book review of that episode, so I'll put a link in the show notes. But the basic concept of passive investing, to have a strategy whereby you don't try and predict short-term market fluctuations, you develop a concept for what it is that you're going to invest in for the longer term, including, whatever level of diversification you think is appropriate for yourself, and then you stick to it. I find that overall concept to be a really useful way of organizing my approach to investment. So that was just a brief overview of 3 big picture ideas that I find it helpful to use to organize my own thinking about money. And within those three concepts, there's a huge amount of more detail that you can go into. You know, if you want to take the approach of being your own CFO, then there's a lot of detailed questions about, well, what kind of finance app should you use, and what kind of tracking should you do, and how detailed should your budget be, and so on and so forth. You can get into that level of detail, but the overall approach is what I find most helpful. Similarly, if you're going to move away from consumerism and more towards investment, there's a lot of questions to ask yourself about how minimalist do you want to go? How much do you want to save from your income? How important is it to be frugal to you? But as a concept, I find it helpful to remember that this is what it's about. It's not about just denying yourself for the sake of it. It's about moving from consumerism to investment so that you give yourself more freedom in the future. And the third one was the idea of passive investing, which again, you know, there's a lot of detail to go into about, well, what should you invest in, which securities, and what should your portfolio look like, and what should the balance be, and so forth. But at a big picture level, passive investing is more of a philosophy of how to approach the whole question. It's a framework that says, I'm not going to be able to time the market for short-term fluctuations. I'm not a wizard. And anyone who thinks they are is deluding themselves, because it's clear that, you know, if you do time market fluctuations in the short term, you're just lucky, because speculators on the whole are always doing worse than market averages. But within that philosophy, what is your long-term strategy going to be? There's a whole load of different things that you could invest in, and you still have to work out the details of that strategy. But I find it helpful to have that as a kind of organizing framework. So those are some ideas that I've found helpful. I hope you find them useful too. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you think. And do come along to the Voluntary Life community on Facebook. Join the group and I will add you, and it will be great to see you there. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.